Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. The last time I was here in this assembly hall was about 15 to 20 years ago, so most of you guys probably weren't even born then. But, Gilman has a very distinguished history. I run into Gilman graduates all over the country. I want to talk a little bit today about some of the things that have provided me with my philosophy and some of the good things about the environment that we share in this country. First of all, my dream was to be a doctor. It was really the only thing that ever interested me in life was medicine. Anytime there was something on television about medicine, I was right there like a magnet. I love to hear the stories in church and Sabbath school about missionary doctors who seemed to me like the most noble people on earth, traveling at great personal sacrifice all over the world to bring not only physical but mental and spiritual healing to people. And I decided when I was 8 years old that I was going to be a missionary doctor. I said, there's nothing more noble a person can do. That is until I was 13, at which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but they seemed like rich people on TV. They drove Jaguars and they had the big fancy mansions and the big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway, so I said, this is going to work out extremely well. And I started reading Psychology Today. I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems. I would sit them down, stroke my chin, say, tell me about your mama. And then I majored in psychology in college. Had luminary professors like Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud, and Erik Erikson, and all these luminaries. And I was gung-ho. But when I got to medical school, I started saying, well, what are you really, really good in? Because, I really think that God gives everybody special gifts and talents. And I said, what are your special gifts? And I realized that I had a lot of eye-hand coordination, the ability to think in 3 dimensions. I was a very careful person, never knocked things over and said, oops, which is a good characteristic for a brain surgeon, by the way. And I love to dissect things, and I put all that together, and I said, you'd be a terrific neurosurgeon. And a lot of people thought that was a strange ideal for me, because at that time, there had only ever been 8 black neurosurgeons in the world, and they just thought that that would not work for me. But it did work. And I always say to people, you know yourself better than anybody else. So don't ever let somebody tell you what doesn't work for you. You need to figure out for yourself what your gifts and talents are, what areas really do work well for you. Well, there were a lot of problems along the way. My parents got divorced early on. My mother was one of 24 children, got married when she was 13. Later on discovered her husband was a bigamist that resulted in a divorce. And she had to raise us by herself in the inner city. And I was not happy. Some people don't like spiders. Some people don't like snakes, scorpions. I didn't like poverty. I just hated poverty. I thought that it was for somebody else. I said, this is a mistake. I was not supposed to be born like this. I just hated it. But interestingly enough, my mother never became a victim with all this terrible stuff that was going on. She never felt sorry for herself. And that was a good thing. The problem is she never felt sorry for us either. So there was never any excuse that we could make that was acceptable to her. And she would always come out with a poem called Yourself to Blame when we came up with an excuse. And pretty soon we didn't want to hear that poem, so we stopped making excuses. But I think that was probably the most important thing that she did for us. Not accepting excuses, because you have to start looking for solutions. And throughout life, what I have observed is that people who are very successful tend to be people who accept responsibility and don't blame everybody else and don't make a lot of excuses. And people who are not very successful always have somebody else that they can blame, always have another circumstance or something that they can blame for it. So at this stage in your lives, when you're really quite young, if you make the decision today not to be an excuse maker, I guarantee you your trajectory will be a very positive one. It will work out extremely well. Well, I was also a horrible student. I thought I was stupid. Everybody else agreed, including the teachers. I was the butt of all the jokes about somebody being stupid in school. And I must admit, secretly, I admired the smart kids. You know, the teacher would ask a question, up their hand would go. They always knew the answer. And I said, how do they know the answer? They're the same grade as I am. They're the same age as I am. How do they all know all this stuff? But, my mother was very disturbed by the fact that I was a terrible student, and my brother was too. And she asked God to give her wisdom and came up with the idea of turning off the TV and making us read books. Now, I was not happy about this, as you might imagine. Everybody else was outside playing, having a good time. I was in the house reading books. My mother's friends were criticizing her. They would say, you can't make boys stay in the house reading books. They'll grow up and they'll hate you. And I would overhear them, and I would say, Mother, you know they're right. But it didn't matter, we still had to read the books. But, a funny thing began to happen. The teacher would ask a question, and the smart kids would raise their hands. But I would know the answer, too. And that got me excited. I started saying, maybe you're not dumb. I said, the reason you knew the answer is because you were reading those books. I started reading everything I could get my hands on. If I had 5 minutes, I was reading a book. My mother would say, Benjamin, put that book down and eat your food. It didn't matter. I was always reading. And within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. Much to the consternation of all those students who used to laugh and call me dummy. They were now coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, I had a very different impression of who I was. Same brain, very different impression. And the fact of the matter is, the human brain is an absolutely astonishing organ system. Billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard, can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. You can't overload it. Sometimes you hear people saying, you're going to overload your brain. You can't overload the human brain. If you learn one new fact every second, it would take you more than 3 million years to begin to challenge the capacity of your brain. So never concern yourself about that at all, because it's just not an issue. But the other thing is, after I started reading a lot of books, particularly about people of accomplishment, I remember one of the first books I read was called Up From Slavery. It was an autobiography of Booker T. Washington. Was born a slave. It was illegal for slaves to read. Nevertheless, he taught himself to read, read everything he could get his hands on, became so knowledgeable, he became the advisor of 2 presidents. And as I read stories like that and many others, I came to the understanding that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. It's not the environment. You are the one who actually makes the decision. And you are the one who decides how much energy to put behind it. And the funny thing is, once I understood that, poverty didn't bother me anymore, because I knew it was temporary. I knew that I could change that it was within my power. It's sort of like if somebody tells you to put your foot in a bucket of ice water, you're probably not that interested. But if you know you can take it out, it's not a problem. So I knew I could get out of that situation based on how I decided to conduct my life. And that was extraordinarily empowering for me. Well, I became an excellent student, that is, until high school, when I ran into the worst thing that a person can run into. You probably know what it is. It's called peers. P-E-E-R-S. That stands for people who encourage errors, rudeness, and stupidity. And that's exactly what they were doing, telling you what kind of clothes you should be wearing, who you should be hanging out with, what you should be thinking. And, you know, I went from an A student to a B student to a C student. My grades kept plummeting. I didn't care because I was cool. I was getting the high fives and the low fives and the pats on the back. I was in with the in crowd. I was very happy about that. My mother was devastated because she thought that I was going to be successful. And now there I was throwing in my hat with the losers. But fortunately, I only wasted 1 year before I recognized that, you know, it wasn't what you wore on the outside. It was what you had up here that made the difference. And I got back on the right track. And I was an A student again. Guys didn't like it. And they were calling me all kind of names. Nerd, Poindexter, Uncle Tom, all kinds of things. But I would always shut them up by saying one thing. I would say, well, let's see what I'm doing in 20 years, and let's see what you're doing in 20 years. And I think they must have believed me, because when I graduated from high school, they all voted me most likely to succeed, which means they knew what was necessary. They were too lazy and trifling to do it themselves. You know, that's what negative peer pressure is all about. It's about keeping people where you are, not allowing them to excel to their limits. And it's a trap when you allow yourself to be controlled by what other people think, and what other people say you can think, what other people say you can do. And unfortunately, there is a desire to be part of the in crowd, to be one of the cool people. The only problem is, when I went back to my 25th high school reunion, I was quite shocked to see that most of the really cool guys were dead. And everybody else was coming up to me saying, oh, we're so proud of you, and we tell our children and our grandchildren about you. And don't you remember how we used to encourage you? Yeah, right, you know. But people's memories change over the course of time. And the most important thing is for you to understand where it is you want to go. And how do you want to use those talents that God has given you in a way that elevates other people? And let that be your guiding principle rather than anything else. It makes a big difference. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to run into obstacles along the way. I remember as a first-year medical student, I didn't do that well in the first set of comprehensive exams. And I was sent to see my counselor. And he looked at my record. He said, you seem like a very intelligent young man. I bet there are a lot of things you could do outside of medicine. And he tried to convince me to drop out of medical school. He says, you're not cut out for medicine. You're just going to torment yourself, everybody else. Everybody will be much happier if you drop out. We'll help you get into another area of the university. I was devastated. Only thing I ever wanted to do was be a doctor. I finally get to medical school. The person the university chooses to help you get through tells you to drop out. I just went back to my apartment and I said, Lord, help me to figure this out. I started thinking, I said, what kind of courses have you always excelled in? What kind of courses have you struggled in? And I realized that I did well in courses where I did a lot of reading. And I struggled in courses where I listened to a lot of boring lectures, because I don't get anything out of boring lectures. And I was spending 6 to 8 hours a day listening to boring lectures. So that was a waste of 6 to 8 hours a day. So I made an executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend the rest of the time reading. And the rest of medical school was a snap after that. And some years later, when I went back to my medical school as the commencement speaker, I was looking for that counselor, because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be a counselor. Because, some people are just negative, negative, negative. They can always find a negative thing to say. They can always find a reason to say that this can't be done, and this is bad. But they never seem to invest any of that energy in coming up with solutions. And I would say, if you really want to be useful in society, to spend a lot of that intellect thinking out of the box, thinking about ways that things do work. Don't get caught up in the mass movements that always sweep things where everybody is supposed to think this way. Everybody's supposed to say this. Because it's virtually impossible to make a lot of strides when you're just sitting in the middle of the masses. And everyone in here has a great deal of intellect, does not have to be in that situation. Recognizing that, I had a very rapid career, and I found myself at age 33 chief of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. People would come from great distances to see Dr. Ben Carson, chief of pediatric neurosurgery. I would walk in the room, and they would say, "When is Dr. Carson coming?" Because they were expecting to see somebody else. And I would say, "I'm Dr. Carson." And some people would just about have a seizure, which is how I got interested in seizure surgery. But no, that's not how I got interested. But, no one ever walked out as you began to explain, what the problem was, what you intended to do about it. It became very clear quite soon that you knew what you were talking about. But recognize as a young person that you're endowed with a lot of energy. It's a time in your life where you can probably get a lot accomplished. And, when you look at people who win things like Nobel Prizes in science, math, they generally are in their 50s, 60s, 70s when they get those awards. But it's for work they did when they were in their 20s and 30s. So the early part of your life, don't let anybody disparage your youth, because it's amazing what you'll be able to accomplish with what you're learning right now, what you will learn in college and in graduate school, and it'll make a big difference. Well, in my career, I ran into a lot of controversy, and it was primarily because I was thinking out of the box. For instance, when it came to achondroplasts, the little dwarfs, 7% of them would die spontaneously early on. And it was because bone at the base of the skull was crushing the brainstem, and they would just die in their sleep. And neurosurgeons would try to do procedures, but the area was so tight that frequently it made them worse or it killed them. And I remember going to the first international conference on human achondroplasia in Rome, and after all the world geneticists spoke, it came time for me to talk about this new procedure we had developed at Hopkins to fix this problem without insinuating any instruments in the area and creating more pressure. And they were just outraged. They said, "You surgeons are the ones who kill these patients. Why don't you just leave them alone? You guys are just too whatever." And they were quite angry. And even when I came back to Hopkins, there were people who were protesting, calling the dean and the president of the hospital, the Maryland Medical Society, even the AMA. Carson's going crazy. He's doing all this stuff. But about that time, we had operated on enough patients that we were able to reveal the data. And none of the patients that we operated on had died or had any complications. And that kind of settled that. It kind of disappeared. And, of course, those operations are done routinely around the world now. A lot of resistance when I first started bringing back hemispherectomies. The first intrauterine surgery to put a shunt in a patient. All of those kinds of things, a lot of controversy until they work. And then people say, "Well, I would have done that too." That's the way it works. That's what you have to understand. So just because you get pushback when something is going on doesn't mean that you have to tuck your tail and run. But think carefully and learn. Learning, I think, is one of the real keys here. The best way and the smartest people are able to learn from what other people did. That is the way you solve problems. You don't have to make the mistake and then learn from it. You can learn from what other people did. And, I've now, gotten or found myself thrust into the middle of the political arena. That wasn't what was on my bucket list when I retired, but I find myself there now. But the very same kinds of principles occur. Learn. That's one of the reasons that, I speak out so strongly against things like the national debt. We have a national debt of $17.5 trillion. I mean, that is a massive amount of money. Most people can't comprehend what that means, but if you tried to pay back $17 trillion, $10 million a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year would take you 4,700 years. I mean, that's an unbelievable amount of money. And it affects your generation and the generations after you. And my generation has got to have compassion. I feel particularly strongly about that because I grew up in Detroit. Detroit used to be the wealthiest city in America. It is now the largest city in America to declare bankruptcy. And it's because people kept kicking the can down the road, not dealing with the financial situation, pushing it off to somebody else. And the only reason that this country can sustain a $17 trillion debt is because we are the reserve currency of the world. The US dollar is, which gives us the ability to print money. If Greece could print money, they wouldn't be having a problem, or at least they wouldn't think they had one, because they cover it up by printing money, which is what we're doing. But we do have a huge problem. And if all of a sudden we're no longer the world reserve currency, we become a third world nation overnight. You have to understand economics, understand what has happened to people in the past who've been in those kinds of positions. And those things have to be talked about. And it's one of the real issues that hopefully your generation will be able to resolve. What we find now is people getting into their respective corners and hurling hand grenades at each other, rather than sitting down and actually talking about issues, talking about areas of disagreement. The fact that somebody disagrees with you doesn't make them your enemy. We have to resist that, because as you read more and more, and I would encourage all of you to read not only friendly literature, read books about Marxism and neo-Marxism, and you'll understand a lot of stuff that's going on. You have to have a broad base of knowledge in order to be able to comprehend all the various things that are going on in your life right now. But I always say that knowledge is an incredible ally of truth. Knowledge is an incredible foe of falsehood. That's why the founders of this nation emphasized education. And they said our system is based upon a well-informed and educated populace. They said if the populace ever becomes anything other than that, then the nature of the country will change, because people will be easily led. And we're counting, quite frankly, on individuals like yourselves to become extremely well-informed, because other problems begin to take care of themselves the more informed you are. Much better decisions that can be made at that point. And then lastly, it's so important to be compassionate. It's so important to think about those around you and not just yourself. And there was a time in this country where we were much more compassionate toward each other. When this country was being populated and communities were springing up all over and they were disconnected, people in those communities took care of each other. They cared about each other. And it's something that we must learn how to do again. But we must understand what true compassion is. True compassion is not to take somebody who's downtrodden and pat them on the head and say, there, you poor little thing. You can't take care of yourself, and I'm going to give you this, this, and this. All that does is create dependency. True compassion is using your brain to figure out how do you give people the opportunity to elevate themselves and move up. And that's the kind of can-do attitude that characterized the rapid rise of this nation to the pinnacle of the world. And it is very important that this nation remain at the pinnacle of the world. Because again, go back, read history, and you'll see that this is the most benign pinnacle nation the world has ever seen. Go back and look at the pinnacle nations before us and see how the world was run. The pillaging, the murdering, the rape, the robbery. This is not a perfect nation by any stretch of the imagination, but much more benign than others. And with appropriate leadership, I think we can change things and move to an even higher level of true compassion, of strength, of energy, of innovation, which was one of the big things that led us to the pinnacle of the world. We have the capability of doing that. And I disagree with those who say that this is not an exceptional nation. Because I want you to understand that the reason that you're free today is because the people who preceded you were brave. Nathan Hale, a teenage rebel, a spy, about to be killed, executed. He said, I have but one regret, and that is I have but one life to give for my nation. Think about that kind of courage. Patrick Henry, 239 years and 4 days ago, said, give me liberty or give me death. George Washington rode alongside his men in battle. Didn't wait for a report. Ragtag bunch of militiamen defeating the most powerful empire in the world. D-Day, World War II, the troops storming the beaches of Normandy. Hundreds being mowed down by machine gun fire. Thousands. Did they turn back? No, they stepped over the bodies of their dead comrades and they overwhelmed the Axis forces. Why did they do that? So that you could be free. Always think about that. And if it hadn't been for this country, the ability to send its young men from the countries, the cities, the suburbs, to fight a war on two fronts of the world, that sent its young women into the factories to build more airplanes, tanks, and mortars than the world could imagine, that stopped the march of tyranny and changed the course of the world, you wouldn't be sitting here today. Bravery. And that's what is required. Because when you sing our national anthem, and you come to the end of that first stanza, it says, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Just remember, it is impossible to be free without being brave. Thank you very much. It's been a great audience. Thank you. Thank you. Now, we do have an opportunity for a few questions. For those who can speak quite loudly and project their voices, we'd be glad to have you stand up and be acknowledged. Yes?
From the medical side of the health industry, how do you think we can reform the healthcare system.
Okay. How can we reform the healthcare system? Do we need healthcare reform? Absolutely. Is healthcare a right? Absolutely not. Is healthcare a responsibility for a compassionate society? Absolutely yes. We spend more than twice as much per capita on healthcare as the next closest nation in the world. So it's not a matter of us not putting enough money into it. It's a matter of horrible inefficiency and wrong-headed policies. Can we fix it? Absolutely. Later this week, I will be on Capitol Hill talking to the Health Caucus about some ideals for doing this. But we have plenty of money to be able to do it. The problem is that when we take something as important as healthcare, and it is, to give you an ideal, if somebody told you you had just inherited $5 billion, and then you found out that you only have 3 weeks to live, wouldn't be so great, would it? You would gladly give the $5 billion back and have your life. It gives you some idea of how important your life and your health is. It's the most important thing that you possess. That's the reason that I have stood so strongly against a government takeover of healthcare. Your healthcare should be in your hands, not in the hands of somebody else. It's the most important thing you have. And that's the change that I think needs to be made, and that's what I will be emphasizing. I have, when I was talking to some administration officials before the healthcare passed, I said, there's a lot of things in this policy that I like, and I think everybody likes. Why don't we use those as the foundation of healthcare reform, start with that, and then together build something that works for everybody, that leaves the control in the hands of patients and healthcare providers. I said, if you just pass this thing on the basis of one party with unanimous opposition from the other side, all you're going to have is animosity. You're never going to have any cooperation. You're going to lose the House. You may lose the Senate. And they said to me, you're probably right, but, and that's always the answer, but. This is Washington, and this is politics. That's the problem. When we start taking important things that are important to all of us and we start playing politics with them, this is what we end up with. We are capable of doing much better than this. And I'm hopeful that your generation is paying attention to what is going on here with all of this animosity, because we can work together. And as I said at the National Prayer Breakfast, you know, for an eagle to fly, it needs 2 wings, a left wing and a right wing. And when they work together, he can fly straight and high. But when you all have all one wing or the other wing, you're going to always fail. And we need to learn how to work together, recognize that everybody brings something to the table, and that we are a diverse society. Another question. Yes?
Please stand and remember to introduce yourself.
I'm Alex Nelman Jr. I read your book, and I remember reading about you separated 2 joint twins who were attached to the head. How did you do that?
How do we do that? In 30 seconds or less. No. Well, very complex, obviously, and there have been multiple sets of conjoined twins since that time. But the key thing is, in that first case, they were joined in such a way that they shared the major drainage vessels of the brain. And when people had tried to separate twins like that previously, they would bleed to death. So what we did, I was talking to a friend of mine who was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Hopkins, who'd done a lot of work with hypothermic arrest. I said, how do you operate on a little baby's heart and they don't bleed out? And he said, well, we cool the body temperature, we pump all the blood out, and then we can operate, and we have up to an hour, and then we can warm the blood up, put it back in, and start the hearts up again. I said, what a great idea. We could do that when we got to the critical part of the operation. And that's what we were able to do. And one of the advantages of being at a place like Johns Hopkins is, you know, you just have to come up with the ideal. There's a lot of really smart people who can help make it all happen. And again, and that's a concept that's very important in almost anything, not just medicine, engineering, education. even running the government. There's a lot of really smart people. And if you can, amalgamate that knowledge and direct it in the right way, it is absolutely incredible what you can get accomplished. Hi.
I'm Ethan Manning, I'm a junior. First, I'd really just like to thank you very much for coming to speak to us today about your career. And I realize that you're a doctor and that you have been you've been invited here to speak on your medical career. However, since you've stepped into the political realm, you have made several statements of changing political and personal beliefs. I'd like to ask if you could elaborate on a statement you made running gay rights so much need when you said, of course, gay people should have the same rights as everyone else, but they don't get extra. And I was wondering if you believe that giving an oppressed group rights that a majority of always had is considered extra.
Okay, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. When I say that I believe that all people in our society get the same rights, I mean exactly that. When I say that nobody gets extra rights would be being able to redefine something for everybody else. It's sort of like with the whole gay marriage issue. I have, again, no problem with any two adults making any kind of association they want. That's not a problem at all. But gay marriage is sort of like a new group of mathematicians comes along. And they say 2 + 2 is 5. And the traditional people say, no, 2 + 2 is 4. It's always been 4. And the new ones say, no, we insist it's 5. Okay, so the old ones say, okay, I tell you what, it can be 5 for you, but for us, it's 4. And the new ones say, no, it has to be 5 for you too. And if it's not, then you're a mathophobe. And that's the kind of situation that we have. Everybody has the right to do what they want to do, but nobody has the right to redefine it. And I'll tell you why I think that's important. If you redefine it for one group, later on you're going to have to redefine it for another group. And then you're going to have to redefine it for another group, and eventually it means nothing. You look at the countries like in Scandinavia where they legalized it many years ago. How many people get married there anymore? How many traditional marriages? Less than 30%. So these things don't happen in isolation. And that's why I say anybody can do anything they want. That's fair. But when you begin to do things that totally affect everybody else, then you're getting extra rights. And that's a very difficult concept for people to understand, that somebody can be non-homophobic but still believe in traditional marriage. And I've asked leaders of the gay movement, what position, I said, I'm a very reasonable person, I said, what position can reasonable people take that does not include redefining marriage that would be acceptable to you? And after much contemplation, they said, there is no position. There's only one position. You have to embrace what we believe. Well, that's what's known as the my way or the highway philosophy. And it doesn't matter who embraces it, it is wrong. And this is what we as Americans have to understand. Even though somebody has something and it seems so right, oh yeah, this is right. No, what is right is to treat everybody exactly the same. And that's why I feel that way. Thank you all very much.